I still remember the exact number. $510,000. I've written it down so many times in my notebook that the pen tore through the page on the last try. $510,000. That's not a number you forget. That's not a mistake you explain away at a dinner table or laugh about with old friends. That's the kind of number that sits in your chest at 3 a.m. and refuses to let you sleep. That's the number that tells you exactly how lost you were and for how long. My name is Elliott Marsh. I'm 71 years old. I spent 35 years managing a factory floor in Michigan, waking up at 5 a.m, wearing steel-toed boots, watching machines run and listening to them break. I was good at my job. I was responsible. I was the kind of man who paid his bills before he bought groceries, who kept an emergency fund, who read his pension statements twice a year. I had $45,000 coming in annually from my pension. Not rich, not struggling, just steady. I'd planned my retirement around that number. It was enough to live modestly, to travel twice a year, to feel like I'd earned something after all those decades of early mornings. I thought I was set. I thought I was safe. I was wrong about both. I want to be clear before I say anything else. I don't blame Carmen for everything. Some of this is on me. Most of it, honestly. Because I was lonely in a way that I hadn't admitted to myself, and lonely men who won't admit their loneliness are the most dangerous kind. My first wife, Patricia, passed away 7 years before I ever stepped foot in the Philippines. Cancer. 3 years of watching someone you love disappear, and then the silence that comes after that silence is something you can't prepare for. My kids, both grown, both busy, both kind in the way adult children are kind when they have their own lives to manage. They called on birthdays. They visited at Christmas. They meant well. But at 68 years old, sitting in a house that was too big and too quiet, I had started to feel invisible in a way I hadn't expected. Retirement, I thought, would be peace. What it turned out to be was loneliness with good weather. I went to Cebu the first time because a man I used to work with, a guy named Frank Hollister, had retired there 2 years ahead of me and wouldn't stop talking about it. He called it paradise. He said the cost of living was low, the people were warm, the food was good, and a man his age could feel alive again. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't. The moment I landed, something shifted in me, the heat, the noise, the color of everything. It felt like the opposite of my house in Michigan. It felt like waking up. I rented a small apartment near the waterfront for my first month, just to see what it felt like, and within 2 weeks, I had already decided I wanted to come back. The place did something to me that I didn't fully understand at the time. Looking back, I think what it did was make me feel young enough to hope again. And hope, when you've been alone as long as I had, is a dangerous thing. I met Carmen Villegas on a Thursday afternoon in late November. I had wandered into a small gift and textile shop near the Central Market, one of those places that sells hand-woven cloth, dried mango, little carved wood figurines. Carmen owned the shop. She was 44 years old, with dark eyes and a way of smiling that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. She spoke English well, confident but not showy about it, and she had this warmth when she talked that felt completely genuine. She didn't flirt, that's important to say. She didn't do any of the things I might have expected. She just talked to me, asked where I was from, asked what I did before I retired, asked if I liked Cebu or if I was just passing through. Nobody had asked me genuine questions like that in a long time. I bought 2 scarves I didn't need and stayed in that shop for nearly 2 hours. I went back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of my first week of knowing her, we had eaten dinner together twice and walked along the waterfront once, and I had already started telling her things about my life that I hadn't told anyone in years. About Patricia, about the factory, about how strange it felt to have no schedule anymore. Carmen listened. She really listened. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details I mentioned in passing. She told me about her own life, her late father, her mother who still lived nearby, her younger brother who had struggled to find steady work. She had built the shop herself over 8 years, she said, starting with almost nothing. She was proud of it. I could hear that pride in her voice, and I respected it. By the time my first month in Cebu was over, I had made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to come back, not just for a vacation permanently, or as close to permanently as a man in my situation could manage. I flew home to Michigan, put my house on the market, sold most of what I owned, and 6 months later I was back in Cebu with a suitcase and a long-stay visa, and more money in my account than I'd ever had liquid at one time. The house sale had given me roughly $420,000 on top of my savings. Between that and my pension, I had what felt like security. I had a plan. I was going to live quietly, spend carefully, and enjoy whatever years I had left, and I was going to be close to Carmen. We weren't romantic, at that point, in any official way. But there was something between us that felt like more than friendship. She cooked for me sometimes at her apartment. I helped her carry inventory when a new shipment arrived. We watched movies together on her small television. She introduced me to her mother, a small, quiet woman named Nanay Cora who smiled at me like I was someone worth knowing. I met her brother, Dante, briefly, a thin young man in his early 30s who shook my hand and said very little. Carmen talked about him with a kind of tired affection, the way you talk about someone you love but who keeps causing you worry. I didn't think much of it then. The first time she asked me for money, we had been spending time together for about 4 months. She came to me looking stressed, her shop books spread on the table, and she explained that she had an opportunity to buy a significant amount of inventory at a very good price, but her supplier required full payment within 2 weeks, and she didn't have the cash flow. She said it would double her shop income if she could pull it off. She wasn't begging. She was explaining it the way a businesswoman explains a problem, matter of fact and clear. She said she hated to ask. She said she'd understand if I said no. She asked for $40,000. I gave her $85,000. I don't know exactly why I gave her more than she asked. I think part of me wanted her to see me as generous. I think part of me wanted to feel like I was doing something that mattered. I told myself it was an investment. I told myself she was going to pay it back over time. She thanked me with a kind of quiet gratitude that felt completely sincere. She held my hands and looked at me and said, "Elliott, I don't know how to say how much this means." I believed her completely. The shop did seem to improve. She showed me new products, talked excitedly about customer volume, showed me what she said were improved sales numbers in a handwritten ledger. I had no reason to doubt any of it. I didn't examine the numbers carefully. Why would I? I was a retired factory manager, not her accountant. And more than that, I trusted her. By then, I think I was already in love with her, though I hadn't fully named it to myself. I just knew that being near her was the only time I didn't feel like a man waiting for his life to end. Somewhere around the 6-month mark, things between us became more openly romantic. She let me hold her hand during a walk. She leaned against my shoulder during a movie. She started calling me my Elliott in a soft, teasing way that I thought about long after she said it. I told myself I knew what I was doing. I told myself I was old enough to know the difference between real affection and performance. I was not. The second request came 3 months after the first. Her mother needed medical attention, something with her heart, Carmen said, a specialist in Cebu City who required private payment. She showed me a printed document from what looked like a medical clinic. The estimated cost was listed in pesos, and she said the conversion came to approximately $85,000. I wired it within the week. I told myself I was taking care of her family. I told myself that's what a man does when he loves someone. I didn't ask to speak with the doctor. I didn't ask to see Nanay Cora in the hospital. Carmen said her mother was embarrassed to be seen in a weakened state, and I respected that because I am from a generation where that kind of privacy made sense to me. About 4 months after that came Dante. Carmen came to me in tears, the first time I had ever seen her cry, and told me her brother had gotten into serious legal trouble. She didn't give me all the details at first. She said it involved a business deal that went wrong, and someone who was threatening to press criminal charges unless a settlement was paid. She said it quietly, like she was ashamed. She said she couldn't let her brother go to prison. She asked for $80,000. I gave it without asking nearly enough questions. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself family is family. The truth is that Seeing her cry broke something open in me, and I couldn't stand the thought of being the reason she stayed in pain when I had the ability to fix it. Looking back now, I realized that the tears came exactly when they needed to. They appeared when she needed them and disappeared immediately after. But at the time, I interpreted that as strength. I thought she was the kind of woman who cried only when things were truly desperate and composed herself quickly because she was tough. What it actually was, and I understand this now, was precision. She knew exactly how much emotion to show to get exactly what she needed. The pattern continued. A second business, she wanted to open a small cafe adjacent to her shop. She had a location, a supplier, a plan. She was so bright about it, so detailed, so full of energy when she described it. I gave her $95,000. She said we could be partners. She showed me the lease agreement. She took me to the space, empty and dusty, and pointed at where the counter would go, where the tables would sit. She held my hand the whole time. I stood in that empty room imagining something we'd built together, and I felt more useful than I had in years. I had to refill my accounts twice during the second year. Each time I told myself it was a temporary adjustment, that I was drawing down savings strategically, that the shop and the cafe would eventually generate returns. None of it was rational. All of it felt rational in the moment. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of thing. It doesn't feel like losing your mind. It feels like love. It feels like purpose. It feels like finally being the man you always wanted to be for someone. There was one night during the second year when I almost saw clearly. I had been going over my account balances late at night, something I rarely let myself do, because the numbers made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain to myself, and I realized I had transferred just over $320,000 in less than 18 months. My pension had paid me roughly $60,000 in that same period. I sat with that discrepancy for a long time. I remember feeling a cold kind of alertness, the way you feel when you almost walk into traffic and pull yourself back at the last second. I picked up my phone and started drafting a message to Carmen. I was going to ask her directly, "Where is all of this going, Carmen? Can you show me accounts? Can we sit down and look at the numbers together?" I wrote most of the message. Then I deleted it. Because I was afraid. Not afraid that she was lying to me, I still couldn't fully believe that. I was afraid she'd feel hurt by the question. I was afraid she'd pull away from me. I was afraid of being alone again. So I deleted the message and I went to sleep, and in the morning she came over and cooked breakfast and laughed at something I said, and I told myself everything was fine. Her cousin showed up sometime around month 22, a woman named Priscilla from Davao, visiting for a few weeks. Priscilla was sharp-eyed and quiet, and the few times I spoke to her I felt like she was measuring something about me that I couldn't identify. Carmen seemed slightly uncomfortable whenever the three of us were together, not angry, just tightened somehow. One afternoon I came to the shop unexpectedly and heard Priscilla and Carmen talking in Cebuano from the back room. I don't speak Cebuano. They stopped when they heard the bell above the door. Carmen came out immediately, her expression neutral, and smiled and asked me if I wanted some juice. I said yes. I told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing. By the beginning of the third year, the cafe had still not opened. There were always reasons. The permit was delayed. The contractor was unreliable. The equipment supplier had backed out. Carmen always had an explanation that made sense by itself, but which, added together, formed a picture I wasn't ready to look at. I had visited the space twice more. Each time it looked exactly as it had the first day, empty and dusty. I didn't push. I told myself I trusted her. I told myself these things take time. The final request came in month 31. Carmen sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me she needed $120,000. She said it was for her mother's second round of medical treatment. Apparently, the first had not been a full resolution. There was a chronic condition now requiring ongoing care, and the private hospital required a large upfront deposit for a treatment program. She slid a document across the table, typed and printed, with a hospital letterhead at the top. Her face was calm. She didn't cry this time. She looked tired, like a woman dealing with too much. I remember sitting there looking at the document and feeling something shift in my stomach, a low, quiet wrongness that I hadn't felt so clearly before. I looked at her and I said quietly, "Carmen, I need to be honest with you. I'm running low." She didn't react the way I expected. She didn't reassure me. She nodded slowly, like she was filing that information away, and she said, "I understand, Elliott." I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. I transferred $120,000 11 days later. I had to liquidate a bond to do it. After that transfer, something changed in her that was quiet but unmistakable. She was still present, but she was less warm. She answered my messages, but with shorter replies. She came to my apartment less often. When she did come, she seemed distracted, checking her phone more than usual. I told myself she was stressed about her mother. I told myself she was tired. I tried being more attentive. I tried giving her more space. Neither worked. Nothing I did seemed to bring back the Carmen I had known in the first year. In the spring of my third year in Cebu, I went to the cafe space alone one afternoon. I had a key. She had given it to me months ago. When I arrived, I found the lock had been changed. I stood outside that door for a long moment. Then I walked to the shop. It was open, but Carmen wasn't there. A young woman I didn't recognize was behind the counter. She told me Carmen was out. I asked when she'd be back. She shrugged politely. I waited for 45 minutes. Carmen didn't come. I called her that evening. She answered, which surprised me. She said she had been dealing with a supplier issue. Her voice was normal. I almost let it go. But something in me had crossed a line, quietly and without announcement. I said, "Carmen, I want to talk about the cafe. I went there today." A pause. Then she said, calmly, "That space didn't work out. We let the lease go." I said, "When did that happen?" She said, "A few months ago." I thought I mentioned it. She had not mentioned it. I said so. She said, "Elliott, I'm sorry. There's been a lot going on." And then she said she had to go and she would call me later. She did not call me later. Over the next 3 weeks, I tried to reach her 7 times. She responded to 2 messages, briefly, and then went silent. I went to the shop twice. The first time she wasn't there. The second time she was, and she spoke to me with a politeness that felt like a wall, not cruel, not warm, simply distant in the way that means someone has already decided something without telling you. I stood in that shop where we had first talked, where I had bought 2 scarves I didn't need, and I looked at her and I said very quietly, "Carmen, what's happening?" And she said, "Elliott, I think maybe we both need some space. Things have been complicated." She didn't look away when she said it. She just looked at me steadily, and I understood in that moment finally, completely, that I had been managed. Not loved. Managed. I went back to my apartment and sat down at my kitchen table, and I opened my banking records, all of them, and I looked at every transfer for the first time, all together in one place. The total came to $510,000. My pension had paid me $135,000 over those 3 years. I had given away nearly 4 times what I had earned. I had spent down almost my entire savings, the house money, the bonds, the emergency fund. What remained in my accounts was $8,000. $8,000 at 71 years old with no property and a fixed pension that would not stretch far enough to rebuild anything. I sat with those numbers for a very long time. I didn't cry. I want to say I cried, because that would make me seem more aware of what had happened, more human in my response to it. But I didn't cry. I just sat there, very still, looking at the screen, and what I felt more than anything else was a kind of cold clarity, the kind that comes too late but comes fully. I saw all of it at once. The tears that appeared exactly when needed, the requests that escalated in size just slowly enough that I didn't notice the pattern, the cafe space I was never supposed to see operational, the medical documents I never verified, the warmth that was deployed like a tool. I saw all of it and I understood all of it, and there was nothing to do with that understanding except sit with it. I called my son in Michigan that night. His name is Owen, he's 43, works in logistics, a practical man with a good heart. I had not told him or his sister about any of the transfers. I had been vague whenever they asked how things were going, saying only that I was comfortable and happy. Telling Owen the truth that night was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't. He was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then he said, Dad, I wish you had told me. That was all. 6 words. I had no response to them that was worth saying. My daughter, Faye, who lives in Ohio and works as a nurse, called me the next morning. Owen had told her. She was upset, not angry, just frightened in the way that people are frightened when they realize something terrible happened to someone they love and there was nothing they could have done to stop it. She asked if I was safe. She asked if I wanted to come home. I told her I needed a few weeks. I wasn't ready to leave Cebu yet, though I couldn't fully explain why. Maybe I thought Carmen might surface. Maybe I thought some version of what had happened would clarify itself if I stayed near it long enough. She didn't surface. I waited 4 more weeks in that apartment, going through the motions of a daily life, walking to the market, drinking coffee on my small balcony, looking at the water. I went to the shop one final time, 3 weeks before I left. Carmen was there. She saw me come in. She didn't panic, didn't look guilty, didn't try to avoid me. She walked to the counter calmly and said, "Elliott, how are you?" I stood there and I looked at her, really looked at her, and I said, "I'm going home." She nodded, slowly. She said, "I think that's probably the right thing." I waited for something else, an apology, an explanation, something that would give me a shape to put around what had happened. She offered nothing. She just looked at me steadily, the way she had that last time at this same counter, and after a moment I nodded and I walked out. I flew back to Michigan in early September. Owen picked me up from the airport. He didn't say much on the drive. He had cleaned up the spare room in his house for me, and there was a hot meal on the table when we arrived. I sat down and ate and looked at my son across the table, and something in my chest that had been locked tight for 3 years finally loosened, not broke open, just loosened, like a door coming slightly off its hinge. I have $8,000 in the bank. My pension of $45,000 a year is my only income. At 71, there is no second act financially, not really. I have started looking at small apartments in a suburb near Owen, modest places, nothing like what I imagined my retirement would look like. I spend my evenings at his kitchen table, sometimes talking, sometimes just quiet, and his kids, my grandchildren, wander in and out and say things that make me laugh, and I am grateful for every single one of those moments. In a way I was too distracted to be before. I don't hate Carmen. I've thought about it whether I should hate her, and the honest answer is that I don't have the energy for it, and more than that, I don't think it would be entirely fair. I was a lonely man with money and a desperate need to feel needed, and I made myself available to be used. That is not an excuse for what she did, but it is a truth about what I contributed. She saw something in me, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in myself, and she used it systematically and skillfully over 3 years. That is a kind of intelligence, a cold and calculating kind, but intelligence nonetheless. I was never the partner in a love story. I was the resource in a business strategy. I think about the 35 years I spent on that factory floor. 5 in the morning, steel-toed boots, the smell of machine oil and industrial cleaner. I think about the discipline of all those years, the patience of it, the pride in doing something difficult well over a long time. I spent 35 years earning carefully and 3 years giving it away carelessly. That disproportion is the thing I sit with now. Not the money itself. Money can be replaced, partially, slowly, enough to survive on. What I sit with is the 35 years, the long, careful work of building something, and how quickly it disappeared when I stopped watching. I was 68 years old when I walked into that shop and bought 2 scarves I didn't need. I was lonely in a way I hadn't admitted to myself. I wanted to feel like a provider. I wanted to feel like someone's person. I wanted to believe that what she showed me was real, because I needed it to be real more than I needed to examine whether it was. And I handed over my security, piece by piece, in small enough increments that it never felt like the catastrophe it was turning out to be. I know men who've been through things like this and come out bitter, hard, walled off from any warmth. I understand that response. I've felt it, the cold pull toward closing yourself down completely so nothing can reach you. But I can't fully live in that place. I have grandchildren who climb into my lap. I have a son who cleaned his spare room for me without being asked. I have mornings with coffee on Owen's back porch where the light through the trees does something to my chest that I'm not sure I deserve, but that I'm grateful for anyway. I've started going to a small men's support group at a church near Owen's house. Not a religious thing, just a group of older men who sit in folding chairs in a side room and talk honestly about their lives, about loss and mistakes and what comes after. I don't say much, most weeks, but I listen. And there's a man there named Hector who lost his savings in a different way, bad investment advice from someone he trusted, and sometimes when he talks I hear myself. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. The willingness to believe what we needed to believe. The refusal to look too closely at what the numbers were telling us. The fear of being alone that quietly made us into easier targets. I am not the same man who stood in that empty cafe space imagining tables and chairs and something we'd built together. That man is gone. What's here now is quieter, more careful, more willing to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to spend his way out of it. I don't know if that counts as wisdom. Maybe it's just what's left when the hope burns down. $510,000, 35 years of early mornings and steel-toed boots, 3 years of wanting badly to believe in something, and a woman who understood all of that more clearly than I did, who used it with precision and patience, and who walked away from it without a backward glance. I'm still here. That has to mean something. I'm just still working out exactly what